welcome to the 18th Annual Newburyport Literary Festival. My name is Leslie Hendrickson. I'm on the steering committee of the festival. Thanks for being here for our virtual day. We had a great day in Newburyport in real life yesterday. It was our first return to actual in-person sessions since the pandemic, and it really went well. So we thank everyone who was able to come and all the volunteers and authors and moderators who are part of that. I want to thank our founding sponsors, the Institute for Savings and the Newburyport Bank. They've been with us since 2005, and we so appreciate their support. We have also received funding from the Massachusetts Cultural Council and local council chapters in Newburyport, Newbury, West Newbury, Raleigh, Salisbury, and Georgetown. Thank you very much for supporting us and other arts initiatives around the state. This year, we also received funding from the Yellow School and Mass Center for the Book, which we're very much appreciative of. We have two independent bookstores, the Bookshop of Beverly Farms and Jabberwocky Bookshop. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce our presenters, starting with Kate Tuttle, who is an executive editor at People magazine, covering books. She is a past president of the National Book Critics
Circle.
Excuse me, sorry. And formerly edited the books pages at the Boston Globe. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, Poets and Writers, Salon, Dame, and elsewhere. Rebecca Makkai is tuning in from Chicago, and her latest novel, I Have Some Questions for You, was released in February from Viking. Her last novel, The Great Believers, was a finalist for both the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award. It was the winner of the ALA Carnegie Medal, the Stonewall Book Award, the Clark Prize, and Raleigh Times Book Prize. And it was also one of the New York Times 10 best books of 2018. Her other books include The Borrower, The 100-Year House, and the collection Music for Wartime. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kate, and I hope you all have a lovely conversation. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. And thank you so much, Rebecca, for being here. It's really a delight to talk to you about this book, which I adored. I don't know if everybody who's tuning in today has had a chance to read it yet. So I wanted to ask, if you have the book with you, can you read a couple of paragraphs from the preface, which kind of sets us up nicely? Thank you.
Yeah. Couple of paragraphs from, like, do you want me to do kind of
maybe the last the second page, starting with one whose photo pops up?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay.
So I won't explain this. I'll just read it. Okay.
Just read it.
She's the one whose photo pops up if you search New Hampshire murder, alongside mugshots from the meth-addled tragedies of more recent years. One photo, her laughing with her mouth, but not her eyes, suggesting some deep unhappiness, tends to feature in clickbait. It's only a cropped shot of the tennis team from the yearbook. If you knew Thalia, it's easy enough to see she wasn't actually upset, was just smiling for the camera when she didn't feel like it. It was the story that got told and retold. It was the one where she was young enough and white enough and pretty enough and rich enough that people paid attention. It was the one where we were all young enough to think someone smarter had the answers. Maybe it was the one we got wrong. Maybe it was the one we all, collectively, each bearing only the weight of a feather, got wrong.
Thank you so much. So let's talk a little bit about true crime, which is what this preface is sort of getting at, that there are so many stories out there about murders, and particularly attractive for some reason are these stories in which girls and young women are murdered. Although, as you point out, it is mostly when these girls and young women are white, pretty, favored by society, not sex workers, not homeless people who are murdered at a pretty high rate. They often say, or you often hear, that true crime is really having a moment because there are podcasts, there are movies, there are books. But on the other hand, like some of the oldest songs we know from Britain are the murder ballads, like there, and crime is sort of what launched the newspaper industry. So can you talk a little bit about crime, true crime, and why this was what you wanted to center this new book on?
Yeah. No, you're right. You know, like I'm always reminding people, like they sold souvenirs outside the Lindbergh baby murder trial. Like this is,
Right. It's not
what-
new.
No, what's different right now is the proliferation of media around it, so that, you know, you're not waiting on the one newspaper, or you're not waiting for that story to pop up on the news. If there is a case that you're interested in, whether it's new or old, you could spend all weekend, on Reddit and YouTube and listening to podcasts and looking at pictures online, and just steeping yourself in the details of that case, for better or worse. There's, on the one hand, you look at the consumer side of things, and it's like, well, that can be really damaging, and you can start to get this idea that the world is more dangerous than it is. On the other hand, a lot of people say, no, it like alleviates my anxiety. It's like catharsis. It's, something like that. And then on the side of, looking at the actual cases, there's this, there can be very negative impacts on victims' families, on suspects, on, the case getting muddled, people walking around, there was a woman in England who disappeared, and people were just like traipsing all over the park, and like, do we really need to talk about Jeffrey Dahmer anymore? Like, it's very solved. What are we gaining here? On the other hand, there has been tremendous good coming out of some of this attention. There's Innocence Project work. There are cold cases getting reopened, people identified. You'll have a podcast that maybe does highlight a more marginalized victim that would not be covered on, say, Dateline, and is putting stuff out there. Hey, if you lived in Tampa in the 70s, do you recognize these photos? Something like the Murdaugh case in South Carolina, which I can't get enough of personally. But like, if that had stayed local, those people would not have been brought to justice. That was that outside attention. And then also, I think there are stuff that you can learn. I think that for a lot of people, just simply learning about the escalation of domestic violence. You hear these stories and it's like, oh, it goes from this to this to this to, oh, and you find yourself in a relationship like that yourself. You've learned something about getting out, right? So it is such a mixed bag. It's so contradictory. I've, been drawn to those kinds of stories forever. Like a lot of people, got it, during pandemic, just a lot of podcasts and absorbing this, and then going, why am I doing this? So that mess is something worth writing about. I think it's not that I have a statement to make about it, but you find something with a lot of inherent contradictions, something that you are very puzzled about, something that clearly I have things to work out about it myself. So that's when, it's like, okay, that's something to put on the page. There are, this is not something that writers tend to say to students a lot, is that, you should look at like your Google results, look at the, look at what you Google besides mundane stuff. What are the rabbit holes you fall into? Or like, what's the clickbait that would get you? And whatever that is that something that maybe you want to write about? And I am one of those people where, for me, true crime, unsolved cases, like that is the clickbait for me. And so I kind of, took that advice that we're always throwing around, just like, let me see what happens if I actually write about this.
It's really interesting. I sometimes you say like, gosh, I hope nobody ever sees my search history.
Oh, yeah.
It can be, it's pretty horrifying sometimes, the things that we're, or it can feel horrifying to oneself, to realize what we're fascinated by. And yet you're right, following the fascination is a productive way in.
Yeah.
I know that fiction writers hate to be asked how autobiographical things are, and yet I can't help noticing that this novel is set at a boarding school, and you have personal experience at boarding school. And I'm curious, like, not so much what's autobiographical, but what did you get from that setting? Like, what and why did that appeal to you?
Right. I should explain first, just for the basic history here. So I was a day student at a day and boarding school near Chicago, and I was a year too young and a financial aid kid, and I did not fit in, but it was a good experience. left, went to college, went to grad school, met a guy, married him, lived in Baltimore. And I had a job back in Chicago. He was a high school English teacher. So my old school is where he got the job. And it was supposed to be for 3 years. It's been 21. And when you teach at a boarding school, you end up living on campus. So this is, since we're on video, this is my office. That is the door to a hallway of a dorm of 40 teenage girls. I don't teach here. I don't work here. I don't really interact with the students. So now my daughter's a freshman, so it's a little different. And for a while, they were our babysitters, which was great. It's not like the facts of life. They're not like in and out of our apartment. It's not, I could name like a handful of them. It's not like that, right? But this is a place that I know very well. And, through my husband, through mutual friends, I know people who teach boarding schools all over. And I've also been brought in as a visiting author to a lot of schools. And very different kinds, girls' school in Connecticut, that kind of thing. So it's partly, I think it's a fascinating environment, right? It is a hothouse, it's a petri dish. It's
right. It's sort of set up for fiction. I mean, because like even your book, it comes with this map, or of the school.
You got a map because you're special.
I'm so sorry.
No, but no, it's on my website. If anyone wants to see it, it's on my website.
It just reminded me of like reading Wind in the Willows as a kid, and there's a map. Like you know that you're in a special world, a different world.
Yeah. No, that was really fun. Because I it's a completely invented campus, and it's an invented school. The school I live at is in Chicago. This is in the woods in New Hampshire. I did everything to make it different that I could, right? I made it a big ski school. We don't have those here.
Right.
I had all these hand maps, and then the marketing department was like, do you have a map? And I was like, it's really bad. And they're like, no, we'll fix it. And they had this artist do this brilliant kind of watercolor gouache thing. And based on my drawings and my key for where everything was. I love it so much. But yeah, like it is that like that isolation, that kind of setting. There's also a little bit, not insignificantly, an impulse on my part to kind of set the record straight, because this is an environment that people get very wrong. It gets, partly just super romanticized.
Right.
And that's okay. Like they sometimes are beautiful places. I'm not keep joking about like, it's always October, like in any boarding school, like
right. That golden light.
Right. The leaves are always orange. Right. And then, so it's like that there are vampires. But even without that, people get a lot wrong. A responsible contemporary boarding school is an incredibly diverse place. A lot of kids who are going to be first generation college students, kids from all over the world. They do, great job of inclusion and financial aid. It's a kind of place, I think that just the stereotypes out there, people imagine like Dead Poet Society on the one hand, or they think a reform school or like a, something like that on the other hand. Of course those exist. But it's, it's the kind of place where it's like, no, like I want to write about this from my point of view, which includes the faculty life point of view. And to show this is not like my reason for writing the book, right? But it's this impulse, in choosing this, like, and I like, let me set the record straight on a few things too while we're at it.
Well, it's interesting. And just to step way back for people who haven't read the book yet, I mean, this is a novel that follows a woman named Bodhi who went to this boarding school called Granby in New Hampshire, a very sort of exclusive at the time place. And another girl, Thalia, who was her roommate junior year. They weren't particularly close friends. They were in different social worlds, but they were sort of thrust together for this one partial year, at the end of which Thalia is murdered. And this is not a spoiler. We know this from the outset of the novel, because the novel begins with Bodhi 20 years later. She's a successful podcaster. She teaches film studies. She has a kind of falling apart, failed marriage. Right. She has a couple of kids, and she's invited back to Granby to teach during a mini-mester, kind of an in-between semester 2-week period. And she's thrust back into both obsessing about this case, trying to solve it. There is a man in jail for it. people suspect he might be the wrong man. And she's re-examining her high school age self, as well as pondering the issues around true crime. And really, I mean, I think this is one thing that binds most of your novels together. She's pondering what memory is and why it so often fails us, how it is a distortion often, and both the criminal justice sense of memory being false, but also just in terms of constructing your own your own narrative of your own life. Talk to me a little bit about memory and time and how those work in your fiction.
Right. I mean, I think you're right. This is something that, this is if I have overarching themes to my work, memory and time, that's the big one. Especially, maybe less so with my very first novel, although it's still there, but The 100-Year House, my second novel, it goes backwards in time. It's a theme of a lot of my stories. The Great Believers is about the AIDS epidemic, but it's, then and now, going back and forth, and about survivor's guilt, among many other things, right, which is an act of memory. Yeah. And I made the decision with this one to trap us in the present. Because books can jump around, and I've done that. 100-Year House went backwards, Great Believers jumped, and I was like, no, we're going to stay in the present, which is the closest to real life, after all. And this is about someone looking back, but kind of, through that foggy glass, not trusting her own memories, not trusting other people's memories, things resurfacing. I was really interested. It's funny because since I live at my high school, I haven't had this experience with high school of like being away for a long time and then coming back. But I've had that say with my college campus. Where you go back and it's like, oh God, like, did they move that? Like, that's not what I remember. And then also the memories that just come back, things you hadn't thought about in 25 years, like, oh my God. So that feeling of like, because Bodhi is, is really spending time for the first time since graduation on this campus, what things just recur, and what does she look at with fresh eyes? And along with that, this book is also in many ways about Me Too,
Right.
Literally and just in general. And that for so many of us was this very interesting act, this moment or series of moments of looking back with very different perception on things that we had lived through, things that had happened to us, things we participated in or were bystanders to. And that came into it too. So, essentially, just early on, the decision was this is a book about looking back. And it's a book about, in the case, in several different ways, not just looking back with nostalgia or going, I can't quite remember, it doesn't matter, but like it matters what happened, and trying very hard to get back there, to examine who she was and what happened to her, but to actually figure out what might have happened to Thalia. And that's hard then too, because it's like I have this, I really have this pet peeve about books where memory is like a scene, where
sure.
you put a potato and have a memory, and it's
memories and dreams. You have to avoid these scenes,
it can happen. I mean, it's different. Like if the narrative takes us back there, and it's like,
Right.
Here's what happened. But when it's a person standing there and they have like a 12-page crystal clear chronological memory, 30 years later, here's everything that happened. And then like, I scratched my left ear, and then really? And I didn't want to do that. So then how do I get back there? But it's by putting memory kind of on trial in a way.
Right. And it's interesting that, as you say, the sort of Me Too influenced looking back on a woman's life and remembering times that were clearly, we would now say, sexual harassment, sexual assault, by boys her age, by adult men, that women, most women grow up in a world where, and I think this is really generational, where I think, Gen X women tend to, look back on those memories and say, yeah, that was really messed up. And at the time, you just saw it as like kind of the way life works. And I'm interested in how in this novel, Bodhi, she comes back, she's teaching these young people now, sort of present day young people, Gen Z people, and you get the sense they wouldn't frame it the same way. They would say that is messed up. Like they would say right at the moment that is messed up. And it's interesting to me, like how you draw those young characters and what you make of this generational difference in how we look at sexual harassment.
Yeah, I think we can give ourselves credit in being the people who raised those kids, right? For that something happened there where it's like, let's address bullying, let's talk about sexual harassment, let's talk about advocating for yourself, let's talk about bodily autonomy. And we have a generation that is, of course things still happen. I'm not naive, but overall in their zeitgeist, just significantly more willing to speak up. And of course that it cuts both ways. Like, that the Gen Z kids in this book, as in real life, tend to overthink things and get themselves in semantic corners. But yeah, there are moments when Bodhi is thinking like, I couldn't even explain to these kids like what had happened. They would be so disappointed and shocked. And it is, you just, and for me, like, my oldest daughter is 15, and thinking about, God, if I told her some of the things we did or some of the, like, she would be horrified and disappointed, even, just things that you kind of laughed off or laughed about or participated in, that was absolutely the norm. And someone in the chat is saying like, that their own school had several scandals that were at the time rumored but not believed. And
I see that. It's amazing. That's just
right. Same. And you're like, sometimes like some of them I did believe, but why? It was like, well, but the idea of it's not only like, it's partly like, well, who would I be to speak up? Like, it's not right my business, right? And I think that would have been the reaction, to be honest. Like if for some reason I had gone and been like, I've heard that this person, people would be like, what, like,
you'd get in horrible trouble. You'd be a pariah for one thing.
Completely, exactly.
Well, and so many of the authority figures. I mean, I remember when I was in high school, there was a coach who dated his students, but only after they turned 18. So he's like obeying the letter of the law.
What a good guy.
Right? I mean,
right.
Yeah. I mean, I had a biology teacher who I came in with a really bad cold one day and he said, "Oh, Miss Tuttle, your voice is so sexy today." And I was 15, and that just used to be,
yep.
You just had to like
laugh it off. It would be okay to say, yeah,
nothing to say. There is somebody who's asked in the Q&A, and this is interesting about memory and about writing. When you were writing, because there's the narrative which is in the present day, and then there are these interludes in which Bodhi is sort of imagining ways that Thalia's death might have gone down. Right. How did you write those? Did you write those at the points where they appear in the book, or did you write them all separately and then put them in where they went? What was that?
This was such a this was a wonky process. Originally, so there are two parts to the book. There's part one where she's invited back to teach.
Yeah.
And part two is much shorter, but it's a legal proceeding that happens a few years later. And originally what happened was I kind of finished part one. And then I was like, okay, I'm going to put in now all of these different possibilities all together of what could have happened. And the idea being like, maybe you'll read the first one and be like, oh my gosh, it was Omar, this is what happened. But then there's a second one and you go, oh, wait, maybe no, maybe it's this one instead. I think I watched the Clue on VHS too many times as a kid, where the VHS version of Clue, like they showed the one ending.
Yes,
that's what might have happened.
And you could go switch to the other one. Yes.
Yeah. It was kind of like that. It really, really weighed things down. My editor's initial instinct was like, let's cut those. And because it just suddenly was a big thing in the middle of the novel. I did have an instinct that there was something there I wanted to salvage, that those were important. And so it was a lot of figuring out. how to spread those through the novel, and then also to have them be not just floating there. That my original thing was like, oh, they're just going to kind of appear, but then to be like, no, they need to be what she's thinking through in the moment. These need to come from something. So that was a one of the more difficult things in drafting, kind of, solving this puzzle of how they could work. But those, they're important to me for many reasons. One, because the book is never going to go back there, but we want to be able to try at least to see what happened along with her. And then I'll be very cryptic here, but when we do learn by the end of the book what happened, or a lot of what happened, although she doesn't then go back and recreate that, we have enough pieces of that from various scenarios that we've seen that you can be like, okay, I know the layout. I know how this, I can imagine how this might have gone down. So that I felt like it was essential for that reason too. But it still has to be this, like, she's trying to see it and she can't see it. And when you're in a situation like that, it doesn't have to be murder, of course, but like, just you're trying to picture the thing you weren't there for and trying to imagine the ways it could have happened. That's a real thing.
Well, and it's a real novelistic thing. As a writer, you're trying to imagine something you weren't there for and trying to figure out how to make a picture of it. Was this the most formally complex novel you've written?
No. The 100-Year House, that second one that goes backwards in time, it is really elaborate.
Yeah.
Like we started in 1999 and then it's 1955 and then it's 29 and then it's 1900, and like the characters that overlap, and I had to do all like the timeline. I had like a 60-70 page outline for that book.
Oh my God.
And it's very Sudoku puzzle kind of book. Like it was a lot of fun. But and for me, like that formal challenge was a blast doing that. And it is the kind of book that I, that I like to read, the like, going to figure out how this all fits together. But that was a one-time thing for me. I'm never going to write something that I don't think that formally tricky again. But I am always doing something with form. I've never written a novel that just is one linear narrative. The Great Believers, I think, would be my simplest novel formally.
Yeah.
It's just back and forth, which is a pretty standard thing in this day and age. But yeah, the next one's going to be complicated again. Lord help me.
Are you already into it?
In my head. And it's mostly, it's, I think about a book. I write in my head for about 2 years and then I actually get to type. Yeah.
I have a friend who's a novelist who says that she thinks about characters before falling asleep. And then wakes up and sometimes in dreams has new ideas have presented themselves.
Yeah.
When you are thinking of a novel in your head, is that typically like just while you're walking around, while you're driving? How do you do it? How does it work?
Well, when you've really found the right project, it just kind of fills all available spaces like a gas, and often for me, it's like, I think a project or two ahead, there are several competing projects, and it's the one that you need to write is the one that just fills in all available spaces, which one of them eventually does. And so, it's like, certainly there are other things I think about during my day, but I try to make sure that I have, because I am someone, and I have ADHD, and this part is really an ADHD tendency. I want to fill my mind constantly with, whether it's podcasts or an audiobook, or, I need to triple task, or I get really antsy. And I need to make sure, against that instinct, that there are times in my day when I'm just driving, maybe with music on, but like it's not a podcast, it's not an audiobook, or that I'm just in the shower, or I'm just walking my dog, because that's when I have room for that. And then once that's crackling, I'm not antsy. I'm not, wishing I had something else. It's just, I need to leave the space. And then when I do, that's what comes in. I have like, Shavasana at the end of yoga class.
Yeah.
is like always like, they're like, clear your mind. And I'm like, oh, I'll clear all the other stuff. But then it turns out what's underneath is the novel. And I'll have all kinds of breakthroughs and thoughts, not trying to, just like lying there being kind of zoned out and then being like, wait, I could do, oh yeah.
That's great. I love that.
Yeah.
Can I ask, how long have you known you had ADHD?
Oh, I was diagnosed, I think 2 years ago.
Okay.
And it is the biggest moment of my life. I just, I like a lot of, very few women in years past were diagnosed.
Right.
It was little white boys that were getting diagnosed.
Right.
And for children of color, it was seen as a behavioral issue.
Right.
And for girls, it was spacey, forgetful, lazy, which is what I got the whole time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And but it just, and my understanding of ADHD was like, you can't sit still in a chair and you're, like kicking other kids. Like, and then I actually look at the checklist of what ADHD actually is, and it was like, oh my God, like this is ding, 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 ding. It's the way my brain works. And there are upsides to it too, like hyperfocus. And sorry about my dog, if you can hear that.
No, I didn't.
Oh, good. Zoom filters out. She's been real loud. And I think, the people with ADHD have an ability to make connections between very disparate things. Like you say one word to me and I have 17 stories I can tell you about.
Right.
And that is, I think this is one of the reasons that a lot of ADHD people go into creative careers, and a lot of people in creative careers have diagnosed or undiagnosed ADHD, but that like network, right, of just the stuff that, like it's the meme of the guy with the red string at the
Right.
Is just is the way that my brain works. So
yeah, I cannot tell you how many women I know in the last few years, especially writer friends. I mean, that's who I know, but so many women who write have learned recently and been diagnosed recently, and it is like a big light bulb moment.
yeah.
It's very interesting. I wanted to get at something else that I think is very interesting about the book, and it kind of comes up in The Great Believers too. So in The Great Believers, you're writing, you're a straight married woman, and you're writing about gay men and their friends. I mean, they're not all men in the book, but you're writing about, AIDS and how it affects these friendships and these communities. And then here in this book, there's a lot about race and the ways that racism infects our criminal justice system. And I would love to hear you talk about like how you approach writing into identities and experiences that haven't been your own lived experience, and how do you approach that as a fiction writer?
Yeah, it's something that I think that the legwork is the really important part. I think that you're always going to be doing that as a fiction writer. You are always going to be writing about people other than you. You're always going to be writing across difference, whether that's gender or occupation or age or, it's irresponsible to fill a book only with people is exactly demographically like you, and kind of would be kind of nuts. So research is just an enormous part of that. Talking to people, letting those people read what you've written. In this case, I needed to talk. I worked a lot with a public defender in New Hampshire, who was able to throw me in on a lot of the legal stuff, but also like during COVID, I was not about to get inside the New Hampshire State Prison for Men. She was able to, and I was also able to talk to formerly incarcerated people, and that's imagining that you can guess your way there, empathize your way there. Those things aren't going to work.
So you talk to a lot of people to get things right.
Yes, I did. And it's an act of humility, I think, to do that, right? Mm-hmm. It's not you would like to imagine as a fiction writer that you could just empathize your way, because it's what we do, right? You make those leaps. You are in the act, you're in the business of imagining, and then to say, no, like my imagination is not enough. Right. So for the Great Believers, I needed like 5 years of research alongside the writing of interviewing people, sitting down with people, just hearing everything they had to say. And that was so incredibly, I could never have written that book without it. It was so incredibly educational. Sometimes it closes a door. Like I wanted to have a certain thing happen. It's not going to work, especially with this book, like legal proceedings, right? Like that's not possible what you want to do. But 7 more doors always open. Someone says something that presents possibility to you, right?
So you mentioned that your older child is 15, and I'm curious whether she's read any of your books, and at what age will your kids read your books? Or will they ever read your books?
My 15-year-old has started 3 of my books and not finished them.
Oh no, harsh.
No, she's like a big starter. She doesn't finish a lot of stuff. But also I think it's, she's busy. It's freshman year. It's also just really hard to do you really want to know your mom that well? I get it. There's like probably a little bit of a psychological block. But she's welcome to. I think my first novel, The Borrower, especially, would be, is clean enough and accessible enough that I, would be comfortable even with my 12-year-old reading it now. But they have to want to, and at a certain point they will.
How do you think your novels have changed as you've aged? Not just become a better writer, but also become a woman with more years of experience.
Right. That's a really good question. I think that definitely they're broader in scope. I think I feel better able to take on some really big issues, bigger topics. I feel able to do something like really taking a risk in writing across difference, because even just doing the research, this is really funny. So my first novel, The Borrower, it's about a librarian who inadvertently kidnaps a 10-year-old boy. And I was way too nervous to talk to any actual librarians for that book. I did all kinds of research online. I knew librarians, but I wasn't to be like, I'm a writer and I have questions, and they'd be like, oh, what have you written? And it would have been fine, but I was just so, and so the one thing I did wrong, well, it wasn't technically wrong. This is based on a lot of research. I had someone who was working in a library, working circulation. She did not have a master's of library science degree, but she was working in a library. Turns out, and this is entirely feasible, there were there were librarians online when that book came out that were so incensed.
Oh, really?
I would depict someone who did not have an MLIS degree.
And that's what they were incensed about, not the kidnapping.
I know, not the kidnapping. It turns out it's just a really touchy thing. I think they worry about not being taken seriously. They want people to know, a degree. And I think it was partly that there were times in the book, like this woman was called a librarian, and it's like, no, she's a library worker. She doesn't have that degree. She's not a librarian. Like, okay, if it technically, it's not a factual mistake, but it was something where like, it would have been great if I had known this, if I had interviewed these people and found this out, and I could have avoided, hurting people's feelings. So just all to say, just that ability to like get out into the world and speak, interview people, the confidence to interview people and talk to people and find out the things I need to know. That's big. And I could not have written this book or The Great Believers without that. So there's that, there's a widening of scope. There's definitely, I'm a mom, I wrote The Borrower, I started before I had kids and finished it after I had kids, but they were babies, and there's, this book it's complicated, but it has some things about parenting in it. The Great Believers had a lot about parenting in it. And I don't think that that's something I could have really written until again, you could write it if you're not a parent, you can write that if you do the legwork and you talk to people and you get that perspective, but I couldn't have necessarily imagined my way into those emotions. So
how do you deal with negative feedback? I mean, the librarian's feedback sounded very specific and kind of professional in nature, but, you know, have you dealt with scathing reviews or people being angry, and how do you cope with that as a writer?
yeah, I mean, you know, fortunately, nothing too bad. There've been a few along the way. There was I won't get into details, but it was really, it's one thing when someone points out things where you're like, yeah, that is, I feel that is a weakness of mine. I see it. And there are other times when people are like, even in a positive review, just getting things wildly wrong, like, that's not what I wrote. What are you talking, like, you so that it's a complicated thing, right? Because it's not just did they like the book or not. It's like, are they accurate? Not like, do they get exactly what I wanted them to get out of it? But there are times when you get a negative review and someone has completely misread the book or misunderstood something, or, taken a line of dialogue from one page and a line of dialogue from 2 pages later, put them side by side and said, look at this cheesy conversation.
Oh, wow. That's
Yeah,
not,
it would have been if I'd written that, which I didn't.
yeah.
So we can talk offline about
I'd love to hear who that was. I'm sure I know.
Mhm.
Do you read your reviews, or do you have somebody else read them for you?
I do read them. Yeah, I'm way too curious. Even if it's terrible. Fortunately, it's not that frequent. It's not, people are not out there eviscerating writers constantly. It's
No,
a
it's
rare thing, right? But no, I do. I want to know. And and this is, going against all the advice I give everyone else too. Before the book is out, in the month or two, when there are advanced copies in the world, but there are no real reviews yet, I do look at Goodreads, which is not a good idea.
not supposed to do that.
Not a good idea. But it's a little bit of just, it's the one bellwether you have. It's the one you don't want to look when there are 2 reviews or something, because then it's like, this is what half the people hate it, right? But
Right.
when they're like 20, like, just to see, not only it is like, well, are they gonna like it or not, but it's also like, how will this book be read?
Yeah.
Is this, are people gonna, what aspects of this book are people gonna latch on to? What are they interested in? What questions do they like what confusions do they have about the book? Or what will the conversation be? And that's not necessarily useful, but it's definitely informative in a period before you're getting your earliest reviews. And it can be galvanizing, right? Like, if you're sitting there terrified about how the book is going to do, and you look at those and you see people who love the book, you sleep easier. Of course, that could go the other way, and that would be a bummer, right? But it is, yeah. I'm way too, I'm a total Pandora on that, basically.
That makes sense. I am going to remind folks there's just a few minutes left. So if you have a question, drop it in the Q&A. I'm going to read a question from the Q&A, which was really interesting, which said, what are your other favorite boarding school books? Have you read books about boarding schools, and what did you love?
Well, okay, so I have God, there's a bunch of recommendations. There are a lot that I don't love, because they do the thing of like, where it's like, you don't know what you're talking about, right? Classics. Prep, everyone's read Prep. It's great. She really gets it right. She really knows what she's talking about. Lesser read one, The Virgins by Pamela Ahrens, Erens. Oh my God, it's so good. It was put up by Tin House Books, so a smaller press, and didn't get quite the the rollout I mean, Tin House is amazing, but it's the smaller press book. It's not going to be
right. It's not going to be reviewed everywhere.
It is everywhere, right? It's stunning. It's and it's set in the 70s. I can't remember if it's a thinly disguised Andover or a thinly disguised Exeter, but it's one or the other. And she does know what she's talking about. And gosh, she's just a stunning writer. It's a really weird point of view. It's really interesting. And then something that was very helpful to me in writing this book, there's a memoir by Lacey Crawford called Notes on the Silencing.
Yeah.
That's about her sexual assault at St. Paul's School in New Hampshire in the early 90s, and the ways the school covered everything up. And that was, it's just a stunning memoir. It was also very useful to me in thinking about, New Hampshire in particular, where I'd already chosen to set this book. The balance of power, you have a pretty poor state and some very, very wealthy institutions within it. Someone's asking the title. I'm typing it into the chat. The Virgin Spy.
But you are such a good Zoomer. I was going to ask somebody to do that.
Yeah, no, there we go. So just the discrepancy, like you have a school that the endowment is practically equal to the GDP of the state.
Right.
And what is that going to do to, the state police investigation, the local police, the speed with which people want things wrapped up. So that was, I mean, it's a devastating read. It's absolutely brilliant, but it's worth it if you can handle that memoir. It's absolutely beautiful.
Yeah, it's a stunner, and she's such a good writer and so brave. I have a few more questions in the chat. This is interesting to me. Are there any particular podcasts that inspired the story? I kept thinking of season 1 of Serial as I read this.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I listened. That was, I think, everyone's first podcast, right? It was season 1 of Serial. I'm hot and cold on that podcast itself, but the Adnan Syed case was very interesting to me. It did not like make me go and say, I'm going to write a book now. But one of the things that was interesting to me was the way that this group of high school students is constantly reconvening to relive this one day. And that's one thing if you live in Baltimore and you still live there, which these kids basically do. It's another thing if you went to school somewhere where nobody still lives.
Right.
In the woods somewhere, and then what does it mean to reconvene there? And my initial idea for the whole book was just what is now part 2 of like everyone coming together trapped in a hotel. Didn't quite work out that way, but that was an aspect of that I was very, very interested in. I've listened to the really cheesy ones too, and I've listened to the ones where actual like incredible Innocence Project work has happened. I'm going to forget the name of it, which is tragic, but Rabia Chaudhry, who was the lawyer who first brought the Adnan Syed case to Serial's attention, undisclosed. That's
Undisclosed with Susan Simpson too. Yeah.
Wonderful, because they get into the legality and they have gotten people free.
Absolutely.
With that podcast. That's an absolutely amazing one. And that I learned just a lot about innocence work and that the appeals system through that podcast. And there's some that are just a lot of fun, but then it's like, oh, but why True Crime Garage and stuff where they like really dig in on a certain case. And it was useful for me in seeing like, okay, what is out there? What does it look like when a case is absolutely picked apart by the public? And they do a good job, and nothing against True Crime Garage. It's just one of those ones where it's like, you're rehashing like one case for 10 episodes, and what does that do to you psychologically to listen? And I don't know, but it's really appealing.
Yeah, there's something about, I mean, I think it's a human storytelling. We love to have stories told to us. We never outgrow that. I think there's like maybe time for one last or a couple of last questions. One is this woman writes, I feel like every teenage girl has had to deal with a Dorian. You'll have to tell us who that is in a second. So I'm wondering if he is based on a real person.
Right. This is just a guy who just like sexually harassing people in high school, essentially, is the short version. I mean, he's based on many real people. No, there's no one person that, and his specific angle of like his whole game is to pretend that Bodhi is obsessed with him when he's, that was invention. And he was a weirdly fun character to write, fun in scare quotes. But he just was a kind of self-generating character, just there was always something that it was easy to have him say. No, definitely not based on a real person. And I don't base characters on real people at all. Sometimes there's a little piece of something, but I just think it's much more fun to invent people. It's much more liberating. And I was also just being so careful to bend over backwards to make this not my high school.
Yeah.
You know, that it's like, one of the reasons I made, so Mr. Block is this, we haven't talked about it, very questionable teacher. The reason I made him the music teacher was I needed there was only one music teacher at my high school, and it was a woman.
Mhm.
And because if I'd made him an English teacher, well, there were some of each. And if I'd made him the drama teacher, well, our drama teacher was a man. So it's like, well, everybody knows this isn't Miss Bine, so we're good. So that was kind of.
It's interesting because you think he's the villain, and but in the end we sort of all it's more nebulous.
Yeah.
Anyway, I see that we have been rejoined, so I'm going to say goodbye. Thank you so much, Rebecca, for this great conversation. It was really fun.
Well, yes, I want to also extend my thanks to you, Rebecca. Thank you. And to you, Kate, for this great moderation. We really appreciate you coming and chatting. And thank you to everyone who joined us.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.